July 17th, 1936. A dirt road outside Madrid, Spain. A 19-year-old farm boy crouched behind a stone wall, staring at an armored car that had just killed 3 of his friends. His hands shook as he reached for something in his pack. Not a rifle, not a grenade, a slingshot, the kind children use to knock cans off fences. The militia captain saw what he was holding and grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? That's steel plating! You'll get yourself killed!" The boy, Miguel Santos, looked at the vehicle idling 70 feet away, its machine gun scanning for targets. He pulled a smooth river stone from his pouch, loaded it into the leather cradle, and said something that would be recorded in Republican archives decades later. "My grandfather taught me you don't need to break something to stop it." What happened in the next 12 seconds would become the most copied anti-armor tactic of the Spanish Civil War. It would be adopted by resistance fighters across 3 continents, and it started with a farm implement that military strategists had dismissed as a toy. This is the story they don't teach in military academies, the story of how improvised asymmetric warfare was born, not in a laboratory, but in an olive grove. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked even the German advisors who designed that armored car. The Spanish Civil War had been raging for exactly 13 days when Miguel Santos volunteered for the Republican militia. He was not a soldier, he had no military training. Before the fascist uprising, he'd been doing exactly what his father and grandfather had done: tending olive trees in the hills outside Valencia, hunting rabbits with a homemade slingshot, and selling produce at the weekend market. But on July 17, 1936, everything changed. The Nationalist forces, backed by German and Italian military hardware, were advancing toward Madrid with weapons the Republican defenders had never seen before, not because the Republicans lacked courage, not because they lacked determination, but because they were facing armored vehicles with nothing but hunting rifles and 19th-century artillery pieces. The armored cars were Panhard 178s, French-designed vehicles sold to Spain before the war, now in Nationalist hands. Each one carried 20 millimeters of hardened steel plating on the front, 16 millimeters on the sides. The armor could deflect rifle bullets like raindrops. Inside sat 4 men, a driver, a gunner, a commander, and a radio operator. The turret-mounted machine gun could fire 450 rounds per minute. The Republican militias called them the coffin makers. On that morning outside Madrid, Miguel's unit, 43 men and 2 women, had set up a defensive position along a road that led to the city's western suburbs. They had 12 rifles, 4 shotguns, and a Hotchkiss machine gun from 1914 that jammed every 30 rounds. Their orders were simple: delay the Nationalist advance, hold the position until reinforcements arrived. At 7:23 a.m., they heard the engines. 3 armored cars came around the bend, moving slowly, almost casually. The Republican fighters opened fire immediately. Rifle rounds sparked off the steel plating. The shotgun blasts did nothing. The Hotchkiss managed 15 rounds before jamming. Then the Panhards returned fire. The sound was unlike anything Miguel had heard before, a mechanical roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The stone wall he was hiding behind exploded in chips and dust. The woman next to him, a schoolteacher named Elena, was hit in the throat. She died before anyone could reach her. 2 men tried to run. The machine gun cut them down in the open road. The firefight lasted 7 minutes. By the end, 11 Republicans were dead, 6 were wounded, and the 3 armored cars sat in the middle of the road, engines idling, completely untouched. One of the commanders opened his hatch and shouted something in Spanish that Miguel would remember for the rest of his life. "Go home, peasants. You can't fight the future." The problem seemed unsolvable. How do you stop a moving fortress when your bullets bounce off? How do you fight vehicles that can kill you from 300 yards away while you can't even scratch their paint? Except one person refused to accept that. Miguel Santos was not an engineer. He had no college education. He'd attended school until he was 12, then left to work full-time on his family's farm. Before the war, he'd been known in his village for 3 things: his ability to estimate olive yields by eye, his skill at repairing farm equipment with whatever materials he could find, and his uncanny accuracy with a slingshot. That last skill had started as necessity. His family couldn't afford ammunition for hunting, so his grandfather had taught him the old way: leather, cord, and stones from the riverbed. By the time Miguel was 15, he could hit a rabbit at 40 paces. By 17, he could knock a bottle off a fence post at 60. But this wasn't about rabbits or bottles. This was about armored steel. After the firefight, the surviving Republicans fell back to a farmhouse 3 kilometers away. The wounded were treated. The dead were buried in the olive grove behind the barn. The mood was desperate. The captain, a former postal worker named Ramon, gathered everyone in the courtyard. "We've lost the road," he said. "When those vehicles reach the city, they'll tear through the barricades like paper. We need anti-tank weapons. We need artillery. We need them to stop." Miguel interrupted. Everyone turned to look at him. He was the youngest person there, still had dust in his hair from the collapsed wall. "What did you say?" Ramon asked. Miguel stood up. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "We need them to stop moving. We don't need to destroy them. We just need to stop them." Ramon stared at him. "With what? We put 50 rounds into that armor and didn't leave a dent." "Because we were aiming at the armor," Miguel said. Something clicked in his mind, a reframing so obvious he couldn't believe nobody else had seen it. "The problem isn't the armor. The problem is we're trying to break through the strongest part of the vehicle, but armor doesn't make the vehicle move. The engine makes it move. The wheels make it move. The driver makes it move." He walked to the center of the courtyard, picked up a stick, and started drawing in the dirt. "The vision slits, the periscopes, the observation ports, they're not armored, they can't be, or the crew would be blind. Those are glass, just thick glass." The others gathered around his crude diagram. One of them, a former mechanic named Carlos, leaned in. "You're talking about blinding them?" "I'm talking about making them afraid to look," Miguel said. "A rifle bullet hitting steel sounds like nothing inside an armored car, but glass shattering 6 inches from your face? That changes everything." Ramon crossed his arms. "And how do you hit a 4-inch vision slit on a moving vehicle? Our best marksman couldn't do that with a rifle." Miguel reached into his pack and pulled out his slingshot. The reaction was immediate. Someone laughed. Someone else swore. Ramon looked like he'd been slapped. "That's your solution?" The captain said. "A child's toy." "It's not a toy," Miguel said quietly. "A lead ball from this sling hits with the same force as a .22 caliber bullet. I've killed boar with it, and I can put a stone through a 4-inch gap at 70 feet, 10 times out of 10. Can your rifleman do that?" The challenge hung in the air. Nobody answered, because everyone knew the answer was no. Rifle accuracy at that range, under combat stress, against a target that small? Impossible. But a slingshot? A weapon designed for precision, not power? That was different. Ramon studied Miguel for a long moment. "Show me." They set up a test in the barn. Carlos the mechanic found a piece of steel plating from an old tractor and welded it to a frame. He cut a rectangular hole 4 inches wide, the approximate size of a Panhard's forward vision slit, and backed it with a pane of glass from a broken window. Miguel stood 70 feet away. In his hand was the slingshot his grandfather had made 15 years earlier, fork cut from a wild olive branch, cured over 2 summers, with surgical tubing his uncle had salvaged from a hospital and leather from an old boot. "You get 1 shot," Ramon said. "If you miss, we forget this and focus on real solutions." Miguel didn't argue. He selected a stone from the pouch at his belt. Smooth river granite, roughly spherical, about the size of a large grape. He'd been collecting ammunition since he was a child. He knew the weight of each stone the way a jeweler knows the weight of gems. He loaded the stone into the leather cradle, pulled back. His left arm extended, rigid as iron. His right hand drew the sling to his cheek, the same anchor point he'd used 10,000 times. Everyone in the barn held their breath. Miguel released. The stone was invisible in flight, too fast, too small. There was a sharp crack, and the pane of glass behind the slit exploded inward, shards spraying across the barn floor, perfect center hit. Nobody laughed anymore. Again, Ramon said, his voice different now. Miguel did it again, and again, and again. 5 shots, 5 direct hits. By the 3rd shot, people were muttering. By the 5th, they were gathering around, asking questions. But glass is stationary. Someone pointed out. Those cars are moving. I've been leading moving targets since I was 8. Miguel said. He demonstrated on a swinging bucket, hit it 4 times in a row while it swayed on a rope. Carlos the mechanic was staring at the shattered glass, his mind clearly working through the implications. Even if you don't break the glass, if you keep hitting it, keep sending cracks across their field of view, they panic. Miguel finished. They stop, or they button up completely and drive blind. Either way, they're vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? Someone asked. We still can't penetrate the armor. Miguel smiled for the first time since the firefight. We don't need to. When they stop, when they can't see, we get on top of them. We pour gasoline through the engine vents. We stuff grenades in the wheel wells. We blind them, stop them, and then we do what peasants have always done when fighting nobility. We swarm them. The barn went quiet, not because the idea was stupid, because it was brilliant and terrifying. Ramon lit a cigarette with shaking hands. This is insane. Yes, Miguel agreed. But does anyone have a better idea? Nobody did. They prepared through the night. Miguel wasn't alone in his skill. It turned out 3 other members of the militia had grown up using slings for hunting, 2 from Andalusia, 1 from Catalonia. None were as accurate as Miguel, but all were competent enough to hit a vehicle-sized target at close range. They gathered stones, hundreds of them, selected from the riverbed behind the farmhouse. Miguel taught the others his grandfather's criteria: smooth surfaces for flight stability, rounded shapes for consistent trajectory, roughly uniform weight for predictable drop. They sorted the stones by size, storing them in canvas pouches. Carlos worked on additional tactics. He prepared bottles of gasoline with cloth wicks, Molotov cocktails, though nobody called them that yet. Another fighter, a miner named Diego, showed them how to disable tracks with crowbars if they could get close enough. The plan was simple. Miguel and the 3 other slingers would target the vision slits from covered positions. The moment an armored car stopped or slowed, the assault team would rush from multiple angles. They'd blind the vehicle with smoke and gasoline, then exploit every weakness. Engine grills, observation ports, exhaust pipes. At dawn on July 18th, they returned to the road. They'd chosen their ground carefully this time. A narrow section flanked by stone walls and thick brush, limiting the armored car's ability to maneuver. Miguel positioned himself behind a low wall 30 yards from where the vehicles would pass. The other slingers spread out at staggered intervals. The waiting was worse than the fighting had been. Miguel's hands started shaking again. He forced himself to breathe slowly, the way his grandfather had taught him when hunting skittish prey. Adrenaline ruins aim, the old man had said. Breath steady, mind steady, hand steady. At 9:47 a.m., they heard the engines again. 2 panhards this time, moving in formation. The lead vehicle rounded the bend and immediately slowed. The crew had learned from yesterday's ambush and were being cautious. Miguel rose slightly, sling already loaded. The lead car was 50 feet away. 40, 30. He could see the forward vision slit clearly now. a narrow rectangle of thick glass, behind which a man's silhouette was visible. Miguel pulled back and released in one smooth motion. The stone hit the glass with a sharp crack. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the surface. The armored car lurched to a sudden stop, the driver's instinct when his view suddenly shattered. The second slinger fired. Another hit, this time on the side vision port, more cracks. The lead Panhard's turret began to rotate, machine gun searching for targets, but before it could fire, Miguel had already loaded and released. Again. This time the stone punched clean through the already fractured glass, disappearing into the cabin. Someone inside screamed. The vehicle lurched backward, engine roaring. The commander's hatch popped open. A man's head appeared, trying to see what was happening. That was a mistake. Miguel's third shot caught him in the face. Not a kill shot, but enough to send him ducking back inside, bleeding. The second Panhard tried to advance past the first, but Diego and the assault team were already moving. A Molotov cocktail arced through the air, smashing against the engine grill. Fire spread across the front plating. Another bottle hit the side. More flames. The vehicles couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. Couldn't advance through fire. Couldn't coordinate when their vision was shattered and smoke filled their viewing ports. Both Panhards reversed frantically, colliding with each other in their panic. One threw a track trying to turn on the narrow road. The other accelerated in reverse so fast it crashed into a stone wall. The Republican militia didn't destroy either vehicle that day. They didn't need to. The armored cars retreated, abandoning the road entirely, their crews terrified of an enemy they couldn't see or fight. It worked. Miguel lowered his slingshot, hands still steady, and watched the Nationalist armor flee from peasants with stones. Word spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, militia units across Republican-held territory were hearing about the slingshot tactic used outside Madrid. Most thought it was a joke or propaganda at first. Armored cars defeated by children's toys? Impossible. But the Nationalist forces weren't laughing. Their armored car crews began reporting increasing reluctance to operate in areas where Republican militia were active. German advisors submitted reports to Berlin describing unconventional anti-armor tactics causing psychological and tactical disruption. One captured German document, later found in military archives, described the Spanish Republican tactics as Kriegsführung der Schwachen, warfare of the weak. The military analysts understood what Miguel had grasped intuitively. Armor's greatest weakness isn't its steel, it's the men inside who need to see out. Blind them, terrify them, and the armor becomes a prison. Within 2 weeks, the Republicans began systematically training sling teams. Miguel was pulled from the front lines and assigned to teach his tactics to other units. He traveled from position to position, demonstrating his technique, explaining the principles his grandfather had taught him. Lead the target by 1 body width at 50 feet, he'd say. 2 widths at 70 feet. Aim for the glass, not the frame. Rapid fire is better than perfect accuracy. Crack the glass enough and they can't see. Once they stop, they're yours. The tactic evolved rapidly. Some units added sharpened stones or metal projectiles to increase damage. Others used multiple slingers in coordinated volleys, overwhelming the crew's ability to track threats. One anarchist unit in Barcelona even designed a reinforced sling using motorcycle engine mounts and steel cable, capable of hurling half-pound stones that could dent light armor plating. The psychological impact was enormous. Nationalist armored car crews began requesting infantry escorts, refusing to operate in confined spaces, and showing marked hesitation when approaching Republican positions. One captured Italian officer, interviewed after his vehicle was disabled by sling fire, said, "We were told we'd be fighting an army. Instead, we fought ghosts with rocks. It was medieval. It was humiliating." But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Indalecio Prieto, the Republican Minister of Defense, visited Miguel's training camp in September 1936. He watched the demonstration, spoke with commanders who'd used the tactic, and examined the after-action reports. Military analysts estimate your method has neutralized or delayed at least 40 enemy armor incursions. Prieto told Miguel, that's 40 instances where nationalist forces were denied tactical mobility. 40 times you've saved Republican lives. He paused, studying the 19-year-old farm boy with dust still in his hair. The engineers are working on anti-tank weapons. The Soviets are sending proper artillery. But you've bought us time with stones and leather. That's not a small thing. Miguel received a commendation, but what mattered more to him was the letter from Elena's sister, the schoolteacher who died in that first firefight. She would have loved this. The sister wrote, "Beating fascism with a child's toy. She always believed the powerful could be defeated by the clever." The tactic spread beyond Spain. When volunteers from the international brigades returned home, they took Miguel's method with them. During World War II, resistance fighters in France, Yugoslavia, and Greece used improvised projectile weapons to harass German armor in urban environments. Polish resistance fighters in Warsaw used similar tactics during the 1944 uprising, targeting vision slits on panzer tanks with whatever they could throw or launch. The OSS, predecessor to the CIA, included a section on vision port targeting in their Simple Sabotage Field Manual, distributed to resistance groups across occupied Europe. The manual didn't mention Slingshot specifically, but the principle was identical. Blind the armor, stop the armor. After the war, military theorists studied what they called asymmetric anti-armor tactics. A 1947 paper by a British Army colonel analyzed the psychological effectiveness of attacks on vehicle vision systems, citing the Spanish Civil War as the first documented case of systematic exploitation of this vulnerability. The paper concluded, superior technology creates overconfidence. Overconfidence creates predictable behavior. Predictable behavior creates exploitable weaknesses. Miguel Santos had understood this instinctively at 19. It would take military academies another decade to teach it formally. In 1974, 38 years after that morning outside Madrid, a journalist tracked down Miguel Santos in a small village near Valencia. He was 57 years old, running the same olive farm his grandfather had worked. His hands were weathered from decades of manual labor, but still steady. The journalist asked him about the slingshot tactic, about being called a tactical innovator, about the thousands of lives his method was credited with. Saving Miguel waved the questions away. "I wasn't special. I was just a farm boy who remembered what his grandfather taught him. The powerful always forget that the people they're trying to crush have been surviving powerful enemies for generations. We know things they don't teach in military academies." He paused, looking out at his olive trees. The real story isn't about slingshots. It's about institutions that can't imagine solutions coming from outside their hierarchy. The nationalist officers couldn't conceive that peasants might know something they didn't. That arrogance killed more of them than my stones ever could. When asked if he'd kept his slingshot, Miguel smiled and shook his head. "I gave it to a museum in Madrid. They put it in a case with a little plaque. I think about that sometimes, a child's toy in a military museum. It makes me laugh." Miguel Santos died in 1989 at the age of 72. His obituary in El País mentioned his farm, his 3 children, his years of activism in agricultural cooperatives. It didn't mention the armored cars or the desperate summer of 1936 until the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought. But in military archives across Europe, his name appears in dozens of after-action reports, tactical analyses, and resistance manuals. The slingshot he donated sits in the Museo del Ejército in Toledo, in a glass case between a nationalist machine gun and a Soviet anti-tank rifle. The plaque reads, "Used to disable enemy armor July to September 1936. demonstrates the principles of asymmetric warfare and tactical innovation under resource constraints. In 2003, a retired Nationalist soldier published his memoirs. He'd been a driver in an armored car unit during the war. He wrote about the terror of hearing stones crack against the vision glass, the panic when you couldn't see, the humiliation of retreating from an enemy you knew was fighting with primitive weapons. We had German tanks and Italian guns. He wrote, they had rocks and rope, but they understood something we didn't, that seeing your enemy is more important than armor, that fear is stronger than steel, that a farm boy who knows his weapon can defeat a soldier who's only been taught to rely on superiority. That was their secret. That was always their secret. The fascists' biggest secret wasn't their German tanks or Italian planes or French armored cars. It was their assumption that modern technology would always defeat ancient methods, that institutional training would always defeat folk knowledge, that the powerful couldn't learn anything from the powerless, and one farm boy with his grandfather's slingshot exposed it.